Okay. We have so much to talk about, and it's amazing to have this Brains Trust with us. So let's get started. My first question's for Ruby. We saw what the proposed new section of the Constitution looks like, and it starts with these words: in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. You've written about feeling excluded from Australian nationhood as an Aboriginal woman for a number of reasons, including the Constitution's failure to mention First Peoples. Could you tell us a bit more about the importance of that recognition for you?
Yeah, thanks. So my family heritage puts me in an interesting position in terms of the Australian nation because, as you've heard on my mother's side, I'm Iman and Bidjara from central Queensland, and we've been here for over 60,000 years. And on my father's side, my first ancestors in Australia came in 1788 on the first fleet. So that was Mary Taylor and Gypsy Tom Batty, and they were convicts. And it's pretty wild to me that if you were to just read the Constitution of Australia, which is our birth certificate, it's our highest legal document, you would learn nothing about the truth of who we are as a nation. It would be very confusing. The way that I see the Constitution is it's basically a very dry, boring administrative document that was designed in 1901 to administer colonies of the British Empire. And I think we have since then matured enough as a nation to be able to recognise the facts of our history and the fact that we have the oldest continuing culture in the world, and that's something that we should all be proud of. And I hope as well that by entering into this new mature phase of Australian nationhood, we can have an overall more honest relationship with our history and all of the phases of it over the last 250 years.
Thank you, Ruby. Shireen, I've got a question for you. I want to focus on this idea that there's the principle of the voice and then there's the details of what the voice means. And I know that there are people who are aligned with the principle of recognition and of consultation via a voice, but they're concerned that they don't have enough detail. And then in the absence of that detail, there's a kind of distrust that arises in a default position to a no position. Can you, as a constitutional lawyer, can you talk to us about why the Constitution is not an appropriate document for, it's an appropriate document to enshrine principle, but not an appropriate document to detail, the nitty-gritty of what the voice might look like?
Yeah, great. That's right. That's exactly right. So the Constitution is Australia's highest legal rule book. I often describe it as a power-sharing document that distributed power. When the colonies came together in the 1800s, they were really negotiating how power was going to be distributed in the new nation. So the important thing the Constitution does is establish principles, high-level legal rules and principles that basically govern the way our democracy functions. And the other thing the Constitution does is asks Parliament to set up the key institutions of our government, right? So it sets up principles and it tells Parliament to set up institutions. So, for example, it tells Parliament to set up the High Court and things like that. What the Constitution doesn't do is set out all the details and the nitty-gritty processes of those institutions, because that's up to Parliament, right? So, and to me that makes real sense, because the Constitution is locked in. It's a stable document. The only way to change it is through a double majority referendum. As we know, only 8 out of 44 referendums have succeeded. So it's very hard to change the Constitution. what you put in the Constitution is permanent, enduring, right? It's there for the long term. You don't want all the details of institutions locked into the Constitution, because institutions need to evolve over time. That's why the institutions of Australia's democracy are set up in legislation. So, Constitution is about high-level principle. The legislation is about the detail. And this referendum boils down to a yes or no question about the principle. And the principle that we need to decide on is this: do Indigenous people deserve to be recognised in the Constitution, from which they were wrongfully excluded in 1901, through having a guaranteed voice in their affairs? Yes or no? Do they deserve to be recognised and have the ability to give advice when Parliament makes laws and policies about them? Yes or no? And if we say yes to that, which I hope we will, and it sounds like most of you will, so thank you for that. If Australia says yes to that, then it will be up to Parliament to legislate the voice, enact the details, and when problems arise, as they inevitably will in any institution, then it's up to Parliament to adjust the processes and the rules and the details of the voice. So when people say there's not enough detail, I think that's wrong, because we're not voting on the detail, we're voting on the principle. But secondly, there is detail out there. The government has made it clear at a high level what this voice will look like. We know that the voice will be chosen by local Indigenous communities. We know it's just advisory. We know there'll be gender balance in the representation on the voice. So a lot of work was done by Marcia Langton and Tom Calma on the detail, but this referendum is about the principle, and then Parliament will enact that detail and adjust it over time.
Thanks, Shireen. And if people are interested in finding out what that proposed detail is in the Calma-Langton report, could they Google that? Is that?
Yeah, it's available, yeah.
Okay. So you would Google Calma-Langton co-design final report, and you would get 300 or so pages of detail. Okay, thank you. Thomas, I believe that most people in the community, and certainly most people in our community, want to support Indigenous aspirations, but then they are confused or disheartened by a small but vocal no voice from within the First Nations community on this issue. I have heard the figure quoted that there's about 85% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are in support of the voice, but yet there is a very vocal minority. Can you speak a bit about how non-Indigenous voters who want to support Indigenous people can make sense of this Indigenous No campaign?
Yeah, I mean, like any other group of people, the Jewish community or any other community, there's going to be people that are quite loud in having a different view to most, and that's normal. So I think that's just the first thing to keep in mind, right? We're no different from any other group of human beings with our different experiences and perspectives and different political ideologies, but also, you know, people that carry some real trauma, that have some real, issues mentally that will cause them to be particularly loud about a thing and all that sort of thing. So, that's just a very real thing. The way that we can have confidence is, as you said, Mel, there's a great majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support this. There's been a number of polls. The poll samples are larger than normal polling, that polls around politics in Australia. And it's over 80% support. So a great majority support it. But then also you can look at the process that led to the consensus at Uluru, very well informed. It was unique in how well resourced and national it was, well formulated. And if you ran that process again with 10 times as many people and 10 times as much resources, we're going to be saying the same thing to you. We're sick of not being heard when we have the solutions. We're sick of politicians ignoring us. We're sick of them taking away our voice. Logically and because of the history of the struggle, we're going to reach the same conclusion. So It's time to do this now. The other way that you can be confident in yourselves is your own common sense, right? You're here listening to what this is, what it's about. You've heard the explanation. You've seen the words up there on the screen. You'll have them, when you go to the ballot box, that this is safe and it's meaningful and it's going to improve our country and it's going to save lives if we do it now. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. And I want to stay with the last thing that you said about that it'll save lives, and maybe a question for you, Ruby, in the first instance, and whoever else wants to answer. But there is a symbolic aspect to the constitutional change in the sense that it's recognition that wasn't in the Constitution before, as Shireen said. But the voice itself is a really practical reform. What tangible changes do you think that the voice will have for your family's lives and for the lives of people in community?
Oh, okay. Okay, all right.
You can hand off if you want someone to go first.
So I definitely think this will have a hugely practical, positive effect on Aboriginal people and communities. Firstly, I'll say the symbolic part of it cannot be understated. That's going to be a huge, huge moment if we are successful. I often think about the day after, or when we hear about the results of the vote, and what it will mean. If we get a no or a yes. I can't even begin to contemplate a no. But a yes will be just a huge day of celebration where we've all been able to come together as a nation. And I think that is more than symbolic. That's a very real thing. But in terms of, on the ground, grassroots impacts, I think, as you were talking about the model, will ideally there will be a regional and remote process by which the different organisations that already have, a deep understanding of how to manage their own affairs can feed up into the federal voice to Parliament. And I was just in Darwin talking to some Yolngu traditional owners who, are very, very frustrated and disillusioned by the way that they are constantly and systematically excluded from political decisions that are made about their lives, about healthcare and housing and water and things that are very, very basic that we just take for granted. And I remember saying to this woman that I think there should be Yolngu people in federal parliament, and her eyes just lit up like she had never even considered that as a possibility. And it sort of broke my heart, and she said, yes, of course there should be, She was talking about how there should be Yolngu people in the state parliament and in local government, and to see how the opportunity is sort of that opportunity for her people to have that voice to federal parliament opened the new world to her was remarkable to me, because I think that that's something that people who live in privilege take for granted.
I just want to supplement what Ruby said. I was in Yule River last week in the Pilbara, and the Yule River it's a Yule River bush meeting, and it's the tribes of the Pilbara that come together at this place. It's about an hour away from Port Hedland, it's one of the first places I took the Uluru Statement canvas to back in 2017, and it was really easy for me to talk about what the Uluru Statement was calling for, because they were talking about establishing a Pilbara advisory voice. And so, I just communicated, well, this is what we're talking about. You guys understand that you need to establish representation, a representative body for the decisions that are being made in the state about the Pilbara and your communities. And this is what we have all come up with that's important to go to the federal parliament as well, that makes decisions as well that affect our lives. And what had happened in the 6 years between was that they had some initial funding for this advisory voice, and they were starting to make some headway, and that funding was discontinued. And so it's just another example of a voice starting to make a difference, working with government, and then there's a change of portfolios of ministers or whatever, and next thing you know, they're silenced again. And then there was this part that I think is really important for us to understand, is that the great difficulty otherwise for the people to work together across the Pilbara to be able to reach consensus and put coherent solutions forward in a really strong way. Because if you imagine yourself in their shoes, if you're in a remote community that's hundreds of kilometres away from the nearest town, and that nearest town is Port Edland anyway, and power and internet is unreliable, and you've got multiple families sharing one house because housing is still an issue in these communities, and only a few of you have a licence, one car between you. Fuel is 3 times more costly than what we're used to in the city. How hard is it for people to come together and talk about what the solutions are and then take that to the decision makers hundreds of kilometres away in the state and federal parliaments? So we take it for granted that we sort of have some access to our members of parliament, but it's extremely difficult for our people without this sort of change, constitutionally guaranteeing that we have the resources to be able to take our advice to Canberra and get change.
Again, just adding to that is, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represent about 3.5% of the population overall in Australia. So that gives us very little power within a democracy. I'd also say that, so in terms of the way our population is distributed, the biggest number of Aboriginal people actually live in New South Wales by sheer numbers. And there's a bit of a myth that most Aboriginal people live up north because of the media. And so up in the Northern Territory, the way it's distributed is that half of the overall population is 50% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. But because the overall population is so small, that's why New South Wales is the biggest. And I think, the case for the practical positive results is very easy to make for those of our community who live in remote places. But it's also very, very important for those of us who live in urban settings because of systematic racism that impacts us in a variety of complicated ways. So, people who are part of the stolen generation, it's a common thing that Aboriginal people have difficulty getting proper identification. They might have a birth certificate, but even with that, it's still hard to get 100 points of ID, which then obviously makes it hard to get a job, and all these different complicated and compounded factors of discrimination that are just embedded throughout all of our policies and legislation, all throughout it, which only people with the lived experience can really understand how to remedy.
I just want to add one more thing, sorry. So the question is, how will it make a practical difference? All the evidence shows that, helping to shape the policies and laws, you get the best outcomes. And one of the examples that Marcia Langton uses, Ruby's mum, in the book that Kerry and I wrote is COVID. That there was actually a rare opportunity, that for us to have some control on how we responded to COVID in our communities, and for communities that are very, the most vulnerable to a pandemic with the existing diseases and crowded housing and all those things. And so through the COVID response, it's something that's actually talked about in the world about what a great outcome there was, that there was, I think, 6 times less infection in Aboriginal communities because we had an opportunity to have a say about how we responded to that pandemic.
Yeah, what a powerful example. Thank you. Shireen, I wanted to ask you about your work with multicultural communities around this issue. And you've said that the No campaign has attempted to pit multicultural communities against Indigenous people, but that has only galvanised the support of those communities for constitutional reform. What's the sentiment among multicultural communities that you've been working with on this issue, and how can campaigns like this one, like Kol Halev, support the referendum's success?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of goodwill in multicultural Australia, just massive. You know, I think migrants and descendants of migrants in this country, often we come with our own experiences of discrimination. Often we come from countries with their own colonial histories. So there's this empathy there, I think. And I think many of us, you know, I'm Indian background and Fijian Indian background, and my parents migrated to Australia in the 70s towards the end of the White Australia policy. They came from quite poor backgrounds but got scholarships to study medicine down in Melbourne. And as a result, like, I grew up in such a privileged way, you know, compared to my ancestors. And that's why migrants, I mean, we come to Australia, right, for the opportunity, the prosperity, the fair go, and we love Australia for that. But when we learn the history, I mean, when we come to understand the history, the fact that this great democracy and the prosperity and opportunity that it's offered us and our families, that's been built off the back of Indigenous losses, you know. As Brennan, former Chief Justice Brennan said in his Mabo judgment, that Indigenous dispossession underwrote the development of this nation. That's just a fact, you know. So when you take migrants and their descendants through that history, that empathy grows. And I often say, you know, this might be our only chance to give back to Indigenous people who've lost so much in Australia's history. There's this story that I often tell that I discovered in some of my research. There was this Indian man called Mita Bulosh down in Victoria, and in the 20s he was banned from voting because Indigenous people, right, were banned from voting in some jurisdictions right up until the 60s, didn't get formal voting equality across the board until something like 1983. But early in the Federation, other non-white people were also banned from voting. And this Indian man, he was banned from voting under the Commonwealth Franchise Act. So he went off to court and challenged his exclusion from voting. And then the Parliament subsequently changed the law to allow Indian people the right to vote. This is in the 1920s. But not Indigenous people until some like 4 decades later, until they got the vote equally across jurisdictions. And I just think, you know, if only that Indian guy had stood in solidarity with his Indigenous countrymen back then, how much progress could have been achieved. And that takes me back to that story about William Cooper, right? Everything that William Cooper was facing, the discrimination he was facing at that time in this country, yet he found the energy and the passion to stand up for Jewish people, you know? So I think we as migrants, we owe it to Indigenous people. Oh, you know, my parents, when they migrated, they could go house hunting in the eastern suburbs of Victoria. As I later came to learn when I was working up at Cape York, Indigenous people up in Cape York, the Wick people, they tried to buy land on their own traditional country. The Premier Joe Bielke-Peterson prevented them through a discriminatory law. So my parents could buy a house to build wealth for me and my brother, you know, back when property prices were so much lower and the value of that property would go up and up, building wealth for our families. The Wick people up at Arakoon couldn't. So the reality of the difference in opportunity is real. There's a reason there is intergenerational disadvantage in those communities, and there's a reason Indian Australians are doing well. There's reasons, there's historical reasons. It's not just that migrants come here and work hard. We do. Migrants come here and work very hard, but we have also been given more access to opportunity, notwithstanding the challenges and discrimination that we too have faced. So we owe it. We owe it to our Indigenous counterparts. Let's do one better than Mita Boulogne did, and let's repay William Cooper for his generosity.